I just want to go through a few things before we get started. And first of all, I just want to introduce the people that we have on the panel tonight. So first of all, we have Brad Viss. Brad is the Shadow Minister for Housing for the Conservative Party in Ottawa. And so he's happy to be with us tonight. Lynn Brown from SHIP. She is going to be joining our panel along with Ian Bear from the Saskatoon Tribal Council. Toby Esterby as well from Camponi. And Usiskin from QUINT. So welcome to all of you guys, and thank you for joining our panel tonight and looking forward to the discussion. I also noticed in the RSVP list, we had a few elected folks that were also joining us, so I just want to give them a shout out. I saw David Curtin and I saw Hillary Goff, two of our councillors in the area, so welcome to you too. And if there's anybody else that I missed, sorry, I didn't. Marv Friesen, I hear, is online too. So welcome, Marv. And of course, there's many organizations represented here with the names that I see. So thank you to every one of you for joining us and helping us out tonight with this. So just a quick rundown of the schedule. We're first going to have Brad Viss is going to share a few of his thoughts from his position as Shadow Minister for Housing for the Conservative Party. And then we're going to have a panel discussion for about 20 minutes or so, where just the six of us will discuss about a few different items. And then around 8 o'clock or so, we'll open it up to questions from you folks that are online. And what I'd like you to do is just to keep it as simple as possible. I want you to type in your questions into the chat box. And we probably won't be able to answer all the questions, but we'll do our best to answer those. And so that's the way you'll get a chance to ask your questions, typing it in there. So just keep that in mind. You can do it anytime starting right now if you'd like to. And we also received a few questions by email as well. And we'll be finished up at 8:30. So I'm excited to do this. Many of you know that my background, I was a home builder for many years, and really it was important to me to see people in good houses. And also my experience on the bridge here on 20th Street, I got to experience a lot of, I had a chance to work with a lot of people in that area and actually got involved with some of the initial work that was done on the Housing First committee that was started about 10 years ago. So really enjoyed the time there. So, and the main purpose of tonight is to listen. Brad and I are here to listen to you. It's an opportunity, I guess, for us to learn from all of you folks here tonight. And it's also an opportunity for you to get some of your ideas into our heads, because particularly Brad has the opportunity to develop some of the policy that we'll be working towards in the future. So it's a great opportunity for that. So that's what's going to happen. So I'm going to turn it over here to Brad Viss initially, and then we'll go from there. So Brad, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Brad, and thank you to everyone on the call in Saskatoon. My name is Brad Viss. Brad Redekopp and I make up the Brad Caucus for the Conservative Party of Canada, and really have enjoyed getting to know my colleague and all of the wisdom he brings to our caucus as a businessman and as a professional before, as an accountant coming in before politics. And I was super pleased to have the opportunity to speak with you tonight, and mostly to hear from you, because there's a lot that needs to be done on housing. And we're just getting going. So I'll just start with that. So I am the Shadow Minister for Housing for the Conservative Party of Canada, and our leader, Aaron O'Toole, appointed me to this job to develop a suite of policies and proposals to lead us into the next election, to hold the government account on what they're doing on their programming, and thirdly to speak with stakeholders like all of you tonight. So just a brief, in the 5 minutes I'm going to take right now, just briefly, please be assured the Conservative Party is not scrapping the national housing strategy. Our objective going into the next election, and even right now in Parliament, I'm on the Human Resources Committee, is to look for measurable improvements about how we can serve non-for-profits and different social organizations, assist Canadians better, how we can use housing to respond to the challenges we face with COVID-19, and how we can use housing to improve our relationships with our First Nations brothers and sisters, to give them more autonomy and say over how government funds are used on their behalf. So briefly, the national housing strategy, the thing we've heard loud and clear, and even the minister responsible, Minister Hussein, has mentioned, is that the co-investment fund, which represents the largest funding envelope for shelters, for social housing, even affordable rental units, that the program is not working quickly enough. And I can tell you right off the bat, and the minister has agreed, and that basically everyone, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, believe that improvements need to be made to the co-investment fund. Secondly, I don't believe Saskatoon was on the list of cities that received rapid housing funds. Were they, Brad? No. So the second area that I've been spending a lot of time on is the Rapid Housing Initiative. Applications for that closed on December 31st, but we learned at the Standing Committee on Human Resources last week that there will be another iteration of this program. The Rapid Housing Initiative, its initial funding commitment of $1 billion was put forward by the government because they were not getting money fast enough out the door from the National Co-Investment Fund. So I've been pushing extremely hard to make sure that it's not just big cities that are receiving funds under the Rapid Housing Initiative, and that it actually helps smaller and mid-sized communities, similar to one that I live in, Abbotsford or Saskatoon, to access the funds and eliminate homelessness in their respective places as well. More broadly, we're looking at affordability for young families. Where I live, the cost of housing has gone up even in the last year over 20%. So young families are having a hard time finding a way into the market. And I know that's not just in British Columbia or in Southern Ontario, but those challenges are everywhere in the country. And then finally, I'll just state that we're also looking at improving some of the things that government does through some of their other programming. I do know that Saskatoon does receive money through the Reaching Home program to administer and coordinate some of the other actions taken by municipalities on homelessness, but that program doesn't go far enough, and it's underserving rural areas, probably in other parts of your province like it is in mine. So I'm really pushing hard to expand that program actually to make sure that it's available to all Canadians. And then finally, we need more data collection. I represent an area that's very rural and suburban, and I've been informed by CMHC that we don't have data understanding the trends between city centers and rural communities and what we can do there. And then finally, I'll say on Indigenous housing, we're just completing a study to look at rural, remote, and Indigenous housing. And I have heard loud and clear that the programs moving forward need to be for Indigenous people and by Indigenous people. And I'm really pushing hard to have that type of recommendation supported as well. So with that, I will stop talking, and I really do look forward to your comments. As the Conservative representative on housing, I can say confidently that we need to do more. That we understand that housing will be a part of Canada's economic recovery after COVID. This is a unique opportunity to make a positive difference, and I'm really looking forward to your questions tonight. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Brad. And you mentioned rapid housing, and that's a great point, because yes, Saskatoon did not qualify for any rapid housing in that first tranche. And I know that there's a number of projects that were submitted into that second tranche that's currently being evaluated. And as I understand, the decisions are going to be made very shortly. But I'm sure that there was way too many projects subscribing for that amount of money that was there. So
yeah, actually the number was there was over 700 applications for the $500 million, representing over $4 billion of potential projects for a $500 million funding envelope. So it's very clear to me that we need that there is a demand out there, and there are municipalities and non-for-profits and housing authorities that have the ability to get some things done quickly, and I believe the government should be working with them to do so.
Yeah, so that's nearly a 10-to-1 ratio of requests versus money available. And I'm sure that, you know, the vast majority of those projects are all good projects. In fact, they might all be good projects. So I'm going to start with our panel discussion now, and I'm gonna start with you, Len. You've been around the Saskatoon housing market here and the affordable housing situation here for many years, and so you have a lot of experience. You've seen a lot of things. So, from your perspective, as you look forward now, are you optimistic? What do you see as the opportunities that we have in front of us now? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, back at I've been around to see when back in the 1980s and 1990s, when governments withdrew support for national housing strategies, and so for 20 or 30 years, there was a huge shortage and a big gap created in our communities right now. And in Saskatoon right now, we know that there's 15% of households are living in core housing need. That means they're living in housing that's not adequate, or it's not affordable, or it's not suitable. In other words, they're overcrowded, or they're living in housing that needs major repairs. So there's a huge need for more and better affordable housing in the city right now. And we are really pleased to see the federal government get back into the national housing game with the strategy, but it's been I think, as Brad Viss said, it seems slow to be rolling out, or to see the money hit the ground. For example, just this last year, the federal provincial affordable housing program announced a new round of rental development in Saskatchewan, and it amounted to $4 million for the entire province for the whole year. That's not going to cut it for meeting the huge needs of affordable housing. And I think there needs to be changes in the way affordable housing programs are delivered. There used to be ongoing rent geared to income and subsidized operations for nonprofits to deliver housing. And today it's a one-time capital grant. And then housing providers are expected to be able to deliver below market rental housing, and for people at low incomes, and also provide some supports for families. And that's a huge task. I really don't think it's a sustainable ask of housing providers right now. So I think in addition to providing capital subsidies, there needs to be also some ongoing operating support dollars for nonprofit housing providers, especially when they're providing affordable housing for very low income families and individuals in the city.
So Len, that's a great point, and I want to jump from there to Toby, because Toby, Camponi Housing, first of all, you operate, I think, 400 or so homes in the city already, and you're working on this Hart Road project, which is exactly what Len was just speaking about. Maybe tell us a bit about that, and maybe some of the challenges that you're running into with community involvement and things like that.
Yeah, we're trying to get that going in the spring here. Moving towards construction start in the spring. I'll echo Len's comments. The notion of affordable housing that a lot of organizations in this city do has gone very much beyond just providing the bricks and mortar. And the housing strategies that the federal government and our provincial government in Saskatchewan use right now are centered around capital. There is reaching home dollars that focus on homelessness and preventing homelessness. But I'm just seeing a comment that you can't hear me very well. Hopefully I can speak louder here.
That's better.
There's some funding that centers around homelessness prevention, but the notion of housing families and keeping them stably housed, sustainably housed, does take a lot of resources for a lot of families that are served in affordable housing. The system costs to people experiencing homelessness or experiencing instability in their housing show up in other sectors. So I think the governments of the day need to recognize where that funding could go to better use. Can you get ahead of the problem? Can you get upstream of the problem that is causing our system taps and identify the places that money needs to go? It does, I agree with Len completely. It goes beyond capital, and it needs to be looking at what else needs to be done to complement that capital, like the projects that we undertake.
Yeah, you're right. Lynn, you're with SHIP, and SHIP, for Brad Viss's benefit, is the main organization in Saskatoon that deals with a lot of the incoming funds from the federal government in some of the housing programs that we have. And so you're on the front row of seeing that money come and get distributed. What have you learned over the years, and what are your thoughts on how that's working? Is it working well? What needs to change in that sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. We certainly are the community entity in terms of ensuring that the Reaching Home funds are getting out into the community. And what we've had, my experience particularly, has been with SHIP during this COVID reality. And so there was some serious, and of course are some very serious housing concerns around individuals who are facing homelessness and need to isolate in order to stay safe from COVID as well. So the Reaching Home funding, we were very fortunate in that we went from a normal Reaching Home dollar value of $2.5 million to receiving about 6 million this year. And so we were able to do some great things. We started some transitional housing. We've started working on reacting and responding to systems, sending individuals into homelessness. But the thing that is not working so well with that is that the COVID dollars are going to end, and we're going to have these programs then that are left in the lurch, and we may not and will not have sufficient funding to be able to keep those things going that have been created that are making a positive difference.
So just to be clear, then, you're saying that a lot of this extra money you've had has gone into more the programming side, just what Toby and Len were talking about. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, the transitional housing, the requirement and need for increased shelter space, youth programming. Yes, absolutely.
So Ian, the Saskatoon Tribal Council is very involved in the community in all kinds of different ways. What do you think are the next steps we need to do to engage more Indigenous folks and to support Indigenous folks in and around Saskatoon?
A really great question. I really appreciate that. It was one of the things I wanted to talk about was the fact that, within our communities, a lot of our First Nations people come from communities where they're very active, and they get to the city, they get to these urban settings, and that activity decreases completely. They aren't engaged, they aren't brought into the environments. Here at CRESS Housing, we start to, when we bring in new tenants, we strongly encourage them to get involved within their neighborhood, whether it be with Neighborhood Watch, start to get to some of the community meetings, and start to have an active role. Because I think what happens is once you start to give some of our community members a voice, they'll use it, right? And then they can start to explain their needs. They can start to explain some of the things that are missing from this environment that they have at their home communities. So we're fortunate in that we have a lot of services that we can tie into our housing component. We have our employment and training. We have our justice. We have a health. We have all these different areas that are able to tie in. And I think one thing that we have to do is communicate with the municipalities, with the politicians, the MLAs, the MPs from our city as well. And start to coordinate better in order to give a full view to everybody involved. The key thing here for us is community involvement. It has to come from all areas, right? The involvement has to come from us as well, and we have to encourage and help our tenants become involved, right? So
yeah, for sure. And just picking up on that, you know, I mentioned that I was involved with the Bridge for many years, and for those of you who don't know, the Bridge is essentially a self-supporting charity. The money, the funding for that, for the most part, comes from individual donations. And so to the point of how to, you know, obviously money needs to come from government to do this, but how can we engage more of the community, more of those dollars and more of those, you know, volunteer hours? And what are some of the things that are working in that area? And are you seeing that working, I guess, Ian? And I'll ask that anyone else that wants to chime in after Ian as well to that question.
It has. I mean, it's been difficult right now. I'm fairly new to the role, so it's been difficult for me to really get going in the community, just because of the era, the time that we're in, right, with this COVID-19 pandemic. So, but I do see a lot of strong movement, and I think that CRESS has historically had a strong presence with our former director. He was very active within a lot of the boards and community events. And those are things that I have to pick up as director of CRESS Housing, is start to get more involved, you know, start to meet with Toby and Len and Lynn, you know, on a little bit more ongoing basis, and then understand the areas that we're seeing our tenants come from, that core area, right? You know, my partner, she's a community librarian with the Dr. Frida Henneque library, and so we often say how our roles intersect, because she unknowingly she'll deal with a ton of my tenants who are there to use the Wi-Fi, or who are there to get applications, or you know, make arrangements to do their various tasks that they have to do, or potential tenants, right? And I think that's what we have to understand, is all along that core area, the 20th Street, all these CBOs, our tenants are intersecting all over the place. They're traveling along, they meet more people, and they've met more of us than we've met of each other. And that's probably an issue, right? Like, we should probably all know each other on an ongoing basis. So,
right. Len, over the years, have you seen a lot of involvement from, I'm thinking, companies and individuals? I mean, obviously the government needs to put money into this, but is there a place for other donors and other people to step up? I mean, we've seen that a fair bit in the community.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to discount the responsibility of governments and government investments.
Agree. Yeah.
Because the scale of the problem, the scale of the need requires that kind of a redistribution of income and wealth into affordable housing. But there is a role for, we've benefited a lot from partnerships with businesses over the years, and contributions of tools and equipment, and volunteer labor, and just partners in legal and trades and all the rest have really made a big difference in us being able to move, do our affordable housing projects and moving them to make them a reality. But really, the big need, I mean, those are all sort of supplemental things, and I would say the way we really move the needle is through more investment in affordable, massively more investment in affordable housing across the country. But like I'll reinforce Toby's point again, is that it's more than about the bricks and the mortar. It's about how do we create successful affordable housing projects where people are moving towards independence, and how do we support that? And that requires an investment as well as just more than just the bricks and mortar.
So Toby, imagine that there is a flow of money coming from government. Where would you see the biggest challenges moving forward? What's the hardest part of making this work beyond just simply getting the cash?
Well, you've hit upon one of the key factors around the affordable housing sector, is that you need to make sure that your organization has the ability to create, then sustain that housing. You know, we find ourselves in an environment a lot of times as nonprofits and as charities where there is X number of dollars available. That the Rapid Housing Initiative, a great initiative, you know, let's get the money out fast. COVID pandemic is nationwide. What do we need to do? There's homeless people that need to have a roof over their head. It was a good try at an answer. It really, really was. But that 10-to-1 application to funding ratio is a key indicator of just how big the problem is. There's so much need that you end up with a lot of the housing providers that could do something successful trying to get their piece of the pie that's not quite big enough. And what happens when you do that is either you end up with you know, an organization that decides not to pursue a project, so there's no doors, or you end up with an organization that pursues a project but doesn't have quite enough money to make it successful. And you end up in a situation that happens from time to time where you have a property that starts out great and then falls into disrepair or falls into trouble with neighbors, falls into trouble with municipalities, whatever it might be. And it's because you need that sustainable funding and a reliable funding source for both the capital and the ongoing operations. One of the challenges that, you know, at Camponi, we take a lot of pride in moving somebody into their new home. You know, we see a lot of other landlords in the city take an approach that, you know, just move somebody out, move somebody in. Well, we take the property and we try and fix it up. We make sure somebody has a nice home to move into, and that takes some cash to do it right. But people deserve to have that nice home to move into, just like, you know, I have the luxury and I'm blessed to have that luxury of moving into a home that I can make nice for myself. Everybody should have that right. So we need to be able to support that. And then we need to be able to look at those families and see how we can move them along as they're ready to the housing continuum. You know, how do we get the person that is stabilized on their feet in affordable housing to think of what's next after that? You know, what does standalone housing look like to someone who's been renting an apartment for 20 years on affordable housing? Why do they stay in that apartment for 20 years on affordable housing? Is it just income based, or is it a lack of opportunity to move to a sustainable home that is owned, or a condo setup, or whatever might be? So a lot of the conversation needs to happen about meeting people where they are at, and then also showing them what's in front of them and showing them what else can be done, and move into neighborhoods where folks can be home either as a renter or as an owner or as anything in between.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. Now, I just want to open it up to folks who are listening to this conversation. We need your questions, so go ahead and type them into the chat box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And I'll give you a little bit of time to do that. But I guess, Lynn, what's a success that you can point to that we've seen in the last year in this area in Saskatoon?
I actually think one of my favorite successes is the transitional housing that was established last year with the Reaching Home funding. And that was a response to ending systems discharge into homelessness. It was a reaction to a number of individuals who were released from corrections into homelessness just at the very beginning of the COVID pandemic. And so we have a group in the community who established 4 transitional units related to the corrections policy. And they were able to have individuals come in, and but in about a 60-day period, the individuals were stabilized. They were set up with income assistance, getting jobs, all of those sorts of things. And then they were moved out into more stabilized housing, and another person was able to come in and go through that same process. And so to me, that's a success story, because we dealt at least in part with that particular system's discharge into homelessness. And we were able to see success in terms of individuals who were moving through that system and getting to that point of more stable housing.
Excellent. I have a question here that from email that I'm going to ask. And this question reflects some of the difficulties that we sometimes run into when dealing with affordable housing. And this person said, a house that I know of has had 8 different groups move through these programs, and all 8 left the house in worse shape than when they moved in. They were violent or had other problems, and you know, was overall a negative experience, is what they're saying here. Is that part of the reality? How do we deal with that? How do we get past that? Who wants to take that one?
I'll start, but we're all going to have something to say probably. So that is that's the surface, right? Like that's what, when people think of social housing or affordable housing or whatever the catchphrase is, that's the face that you see. That's the media headline. That's the bad experience. And we all know in this day and age, it's been like that forever, but in this day and age, bad news travels way faster than good news. So in a situation like that, and they do happen, like that happens more often than any of us want to have it happen, but it does happen. And in a situation like that, most times you're dealing with a household that is missing some pieces of their puzzle. They need access to some form of support, some form of assistance in the community to help stabilize their housing. And that's, again, it goes back to the supports that need to be bundled in with the capital. You know, you can't have one successful without the other. A house like, you know, the experience that this person has had as a neighbor, obviously, or something like that, it's a very negative experience, and it brings the neighborhood down. But it also, think of the next family that moves into that home. The next family that moves into that home is moving into a home, and they're excited to be there. And hey, we've got a roof over our heads. This is great. What's going to be possible? And the label is applied as they walk into that house by the neighborhood. So we, as neighbors, you know, we have a role there as well too, to lift folks up and welcome them into our neighborhoods and into Saskatoon West, into this constituency. And try and connect with them. The agencies that work in the city work with folks like that to try and connect them to the systems and the structures that are in community to help them through some of that. And we just need more of that side of it.
Lynn, do you want to chime in on that?
Well, you know, I mean, yeah, those things do happen, like Toby says, but those are, you know, I mean, we have to put those into context, right? Why people are living in such dire depths of poverty and dysfunction. There's historical reasons for that. A lot of it's related to things like colonialism and violence, and we need to rectify and address those issues, right? And that's why we're saying we need more than 4 walls and a roof to solve these issues. There needs to be a whole basis of support for people overcoming barriers that they're trying to face. You know, and we're like in Saskatoon right now, housing costs, you know, have well outpaced people's incomes, and so a lot of people are living in substandard housing in our city, and they don't have enough income. So we either need to start talking about things like, you know, universal basic income, so people have enough to live on, or we need to start talking about massive national investments in more affordable housing in this country. But those are the challenges that we're facing, and that's the work I'm focusing on. And there's a lot of other things too. There's a lot more transitional and supportive housing that Lynn was talking about. There's more to the affordable housing continuum than just home ownership and affordable rentals. There's a lot of people out there that need some form of supportive living arrangements so they can move on towards living independently. And so there's a lot of different housing needs in our community to address some of those deep issues that individuals and families face.
Brad, do you mind if I jump in for a moment?
Go ahead.
Well, I hear what a lot of my other panelists are saying about wraparound services, and if I take anything away from this call tonight, it's that it's not enough for bricks and mortars, but we have to include programming and better coordination between all of the different groups on the ground, and the government, either provincial or federal, needs to play a role in coordinating services if it's not already being done at a much more heightened degree to ensure that people are getting the supports they need to advance their life and be their best self. Len, I was interested in what you were saying at the very beginning about the 80s and 90s. And actually, one of the things I've heard out here in British Columbia is that when that was the last time we actually had a lot of rental housing built in Canada, and the government should look at doing that again. And then maybe Len, if you could just comment for me about where I live, I'm actually right beside a shelter. My office backs onto a shelter. It's called Haven in the Hollow in Mission, British Columbia, and I'm on their neighborhood advisory council. And one thing we often talk a lot about here in Mission is how do we tie in supports for people suffering from addiction with their housing. Would that be like some of the services that you're talking about as well?
For sure. There's a huge shortage of mental health and addiction services in our province. I'm sure it's like that across the country, but those are absolutely critical. We need a lot more of that kind of support in our communities. Going back to the comment about the 80s and 90s too, was that governments retracted from investing in housing back then. We had a major national affordable housing strategy throughout the 60s, 70s, and then in the mid 80s, they just pulled away, and that left a huge gap in our cities, and left largely municipalities trying to deal with this huge, expensive proposition that was having huge impacts in our communities, right? We were seeing communities that were being facing huge amounts of disinvestment. And even today, we're seeing large national housing companies buying up all of our apartment blocks in the city, and they're just setting them up as their investment portfolio and then trading it on markets, right? And it has nothing to do with providing people good quality housing. It has more to do with creating financial assets for large corporations that's really gutting the access to affordable housing in our neighborhoods, right? So that needs to be regulated, right? Real estate and housing cannot become financial tool, right? It needs to be. It should be considered a human right, not a tradable asset.
Ian, do you want to respond to Brad Viss's question there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things that we really see in Saskatoon here is, that there's still more transitional, there's still more of the housing continuum that needs to be developed. And I think like each of the panelists have spoke of the need for this, and as you look at, like, if you look back at CRESS's history, we did start in the 80s as well. And we've sort of moved through the system of being the social housing, subsidized operations. We're starting to grow into this or move into this affordable housing corporation. And, it's one of those things that I think when we look at it, we look at an environment of the, Saskatoon West and some of the issues that are creeping into the areas, with it becomes difficult on us to really know exactly where our support can come from if you know, we're not discussing this openly, right? And I think that was one thing that we want to do at Saskatoon Tribal Council is put everything out there in terms of what our needs are fully, right? And I think that's one thing that our housing corporations, we all need to do is continue to have these conversations and continue to really stress the importance of developing that housing continuum from the start. And what we see sometimes is you get the second part, the transitional housing, but it comes at the cost of a shelter, and that can't happen, right? It has to be those supports, the shelters have to stay, then the transitional housing has to come with, you know, and it encompasses so many different areas, and then the wraparound services, you know, it comes into the addictions, it comes into even just like a simple need as, and I spoke of this, it's going to having to go to a library to find internet service because you don't have access, you don't have the ability to pay for internet within your home. I think that's something that a lot of people take for granted, you know, and so we have full units, housing units that, you know, they're wired for the new SaskTel Infinet, but they don't have subscribers because they can't afford it.
Yeah. Lynn, I've got a question here from one of the people online. They asked, what are the main constraints facing community groups in housing the homeless and the difficult to house?
Oh, that's a really big question. I think there's many different constraints. First of all, one of the things that we've looked at in trying to get to functional zero homelessness is why homelessness continues to perpetuate, and the cycles are there, right? So systems that discharge people into homelessness is a problem. Having funding to be able to do the support services, the wraparound services, the transitional housing, Reaching Home has done a very good job of putting funding into that, but certainly not enough. The bricks and mortar also is a part of a response to that question in terms of how do we respond to the fact that there is not enough affordable housing units. We've just done a little bit of a survey in the affordable housing sector, and we've determined that there's about 4,700 affordable units, and there's a 12 to 18 month average waiting time to get into those units. And so those are barriers to getting us to functional zero. Those are barriers to serving the folks that are facing the challenges of homelessness and precariously housed situations. And so this, in terms of the big picture, those are the few of the things that are those challenges that we need to look at.
Excellent. Okay, I've got another question here. I'm going to ask it's from Nicole. What is it's a bit of a long one. I'll try to shorten it a bit. What's the relationship between the provincial and federal government on funding? As a social assistance recipient, I can speak firsthand to the incredible challenges of living on assistance rates, including rent allowance assist, not reflecting market rates. What can and does the federal government plan to do to assure people with disabilities aren't falling into poverty or homelessness due to inadequate allowance? So that kind of gets to the issue of lack of enough money, but what do you folks have to say about that?
I can chime in.
Sure.
That's actually another area that we've started to realize that there needs to be some advocacy around some of those dollar amounts that are being provided for housing. We've taken a look at the market value in Saskatoon as well. So right now, an average one-bedroom unit is about $750 a month. And the average income assistance funding for shelter allowance for a single individual is $575 a month. So I understand exactly where this individual is coming from. And I think it needs some very strong advocacy, some close work in this case with the provincial government, with the ministries, and that's a part of the response.
Excellent.
You know, the ministry just revamped their social assistance program a year or two ago. And when they announced the new shelter allowances, a lot of us were scratching our heads and going, how did they come up with this amount when, as Lynn pointed out, the average amount for a one bedroom is $750 and a two bedroom is $900 or $1,000 a month, and they're providing people with substantially less than that. So they're forcing people into core housing need. They're going to be overcrowding themselves or living in substandard housing because they can't afford to live in appropriate housing. So there's a big link between provincial social policy and housing people appropriately.
I've got a question here from Kayla, and it reads like this. Across Canada, we have seen tremendous examples of harm reduction-based housing programs that support people who use substances. How can we create more supports in our community to support this population that is often ignored when planning housing programs?
I'll just speak to that very briefly. Brad, as you know, in our party right now, the Conservative Party has recognized that we have an opioid epidemic in Canada, and the federal government needs to play a role in this. And we're in the process of developing a comprehensive strategy to this very question right now. We're taking this issue very seriously, but I don't have an answer right now, but I do know that we're working on it.
I think
It's
go ahead,
Toby.
Okay. Kayla's question is a very key one, and it was alluded to earlier with the question about, how do mental health and addictions play into this? And it circles all the way back to the conversation of supports versus or complemented by bricks and mortar capital. Harm reduction housing is a key component in solving some of the challenges, especially in the city of Saskatoon. We, on a per capita basis, I don't have the numbers in the top of my head, but on a per capita basis, the overdose situation in this city is on par with centers like Vancouver and Toronto on a per capita basis. And number one, we need to have a provincial government that would recognize that. Number two, we need to have a federal government that recognizes that all levels of government have a role to play in solving that crisis. But from everybody, we need to recognize that harm reduction practices that prioritize stabilizing the health of the individual, stabilizing the addiction of the individual, not saying stop using drugs and you'll be okay, stabilizing the addiction to the point where that person can start trying to get their feet under them while they are being provided housing. That is one of the keys to this whole issue around the overdose crisis and the opioid crisis in this country. You have folks that are in our fine city this winter. We've lost some beautiful people, and they did not need to be lost, but they were on the street with needles in their arms because they couldn't have a house and a roof over their heads and someone beside them to help them with that usage. Harm reduction has to be one of the key components, one of the fundamental building blocks of a housing strategy nationwide, or else the crisis is only going to get worse.
I agree 100%. The challenge, of course, is where the rubber hits the road, and I think there's a lot of work that we need to do in figuring out how to incorporate harm reduction in housing, because you're trying to live with a whole bunch of other families too. So you want to make sure that everybody is safe in those things. So I support incorporating harm reduction 100%. It's just, I think we need to really think a lot harder about how to do it, and do it right.
I see a question. It's almost more of a point than a question, but it's from Mark. I think Mark's from Salvation Army, maybe. He said, we've developed a transitional housing program for men that are ready to work on their barriers and is appropriate to their needs. We staff it 24/7 and develop and coordinate the resources for these men. We will lose 6 figures a year because of the services staffing model and maximum rental amounts that we can charge. It is hard to do, but we feel it is important. That being said, there needs to be a true cost funding model that supports the CBOs that are trying to break the cycle. And I think that's just another example of what we were just speaking about. Now, I've got another question here I want to throw to the group. It's from Nadia, and it's a great question. She said, Is anyone tonight talking about low-income seniors housing? What about a senior who can still work? Is there more to that one? Maybe you just hold on a second. There we go. What about a senior who can still work some, but is not able to sustain rent and expenses and is trying to save? What is the current state of Sask Housing Authority units, availability and quantity of maintenance to be addressed? What anybody have anything to say about seniors?
Well, generally, nationally, what we've seen with seniors through the pandemic is that the federal government needs to work more closely with the provinces. There are a lot of seniors that may have housing, but is that housing adequate? And they may be living below the poverty line. So there's a lot of big social questions that we need to be focusing on right now, and not saying it's one level of government or the other, but finding a way to collaborate and address seniors' poverty, which is unfortunately a problem in probably every community across Canada. Brad, that would be a great other town hall for you to do with Rosemary Falk. Rosemary, she's from Saskatchewan too. Yeah. Rosemary is a leader on this file, and I think that would serve your community really well too.
Good idea, Toby.
Well, it's a super important point, because it's one area of housing that often a lot of people assume that a lot of people in my generation, 40 to 50 or so, a lot of people think that that's okay, that there's not a need there. But once you start really looking into that community housing that's there for seniors in Saskatoon, you start to realize that it's really kind of woefully inadequate. Most importantly, it's skewed, and Ian, I'd love to get your feed on this too. It's skewed because a lot of us recognize, okay, retirement, we live in Canada, so there's a Canada pension plan, there's old age security, but those programs were only in the last few years available for contributions for Indigenous people. So what about our Indigenous seniors? What about our elders? What about our Métis old people? What about the folks out there that haven't had the luxury of being able to contribute to their own savings or anything like that along the way? And how are they being housed? You see, these beautiful senior homes going up. We have meetings in one, like, they're beautiful facilities. They're absolutely wonderful people, and they're vital to the community. And the rent is $7,000 a month. How does that serve all aspects of this community? And it's really a key point, especially for the Indigenous families. And remember that Saskatoon is a medical hub for the province of Saskatchewan. So in senior years, folks come to Saskatoon from remote northern or small urban or small rural communities to live out their years so that they can be close to the medical hub. Mm-hmm. And that's where that crisis is.
Ian?
I think I thank you for mentioning that, Toby, because it's true. And I think what it does is it puts a strain even on our communities, our First Nation communities, because they, our seniors hit retirement age. In some cases, individuals have worked for 30, 35 years with an organization that wasn't able to give them a pension of any sort. Because they were operating from very limited federal funds, or, and so then they have to turn around and go back to their home community, right? And we already know the funding cap on First Nations communities has made building new houses a near impossibility, never mind an actual senior complex, right? And so then it does put a lot of pressure on a housing coordinator or a director such as myself, because I know that is something that's key within our long-term strategy is addressing senior housing. And so what I really have to do is go through. Right now, I do have a few units, but those are part of a very quickly expiring subsidized units. So, those aren't going to exist in 5, 10 years or 10 years. So So I have to move quickly in terms of what am I going to do with my seniors who don't have the CPP earnings or the old age security that they should. And it's a difficult spot, definitely.
Ian is raising a very important point about all the operating agreements that are expiring across Canada. A lot of affordable housing groups were getting operating subsidies to be able to subsidize rents and support individuals, and a lot of those are coming to their end, and those need to be renewed, and we need more of them, not less.
So at the risk of going just a couple minutes over, there's one really good question here that I want to ask as our very last question. It comes from Kayla. And she says, we are seeing an ambivalent and in some cases not in my backyard attitude to affordable housing projects. How can the government better communicate the benefits and social inclusion importance of these projects? I'm going to start with you, Toby, because that's right where you're at right now, I think, with Hart Road.
I may have had a few conversations lately about this, yes. This strikes to the heart of the challenges, but it strikes to the heart of the opportunity before us as well. Throughout the country, you can find examples of how affordable housing investment can become a vibrant part of a community. There's a great example in the Yukon of a housing development that has a shelter, it has transitional housing, it has rental housing, and it has luxury condos, all in the same building. There's great examples in the city of Saskatoon of affordable home ownership plans developed within highly affluent neighborhoods. You have great examples throughout communities in the country where it does work. I think what we need from levels of government is for people to talk about the math. At the end of the day, most of the NIMBYism that you encounter roots back to, this is my asset, this is my home, and my financial value, my worth is going to somehow be impacted by that person moving in next door, or by that building moving in next door, or whatever it might be. So I think the solution needs to be found in the math as well too. You need to have a government that is willing to look at the long-term numbers and talk about the long-term numbers that affordable housing have for an impact on a community. The city of Medicine Hat made the news, I think it was, Len was maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, where they went out in the news and said, we have no more homelessness in our city. And if you drive around Medicine Hat in some of the neighborhoods, you will find a big house, a little house, a condo, an apartment built. Like there's some really interesting things that they did with zoning there. But Medicine Hat is still a vibrant city. Medicine Hat has some challenges, just like every other city, but they did make some changes to how they approached it with some success. And I think we just need to almost in a way get over ourselves and start having some honest conversations about, yep, sometimes affordable housing doesn't quite go the way that it should go, but yep, sometimes, you know what, it can be the best neighbor you're ever going to have too. And those families can be great contributors to the community. So I think the answer for the government's, the answer to Kayla's question, the government's role in that should be advocacy and talking about from all sides of the Commons, from all sides of the Legislative Assembly, talking about the successes that can be achieved and have been achieved, because there are success stories, but we don't hear about them.
Yeah, I'm just going to comment on this briefly too. It's something I actually live. As I mentioned earlier, I'm on a neighborhood advisory committee for the shelter adjacent to my office here, and we face some big problems in our community. Like, hands down, sometimes I even get worried about my children being exposed to needles near where I work, but instead of just throwing up my arms or just kind of yelling at the problem, we're making a new covenant plan, and we've ensured that that people are volunteering from the shelter to clean up the area every day and do walkabouts, and the improvements we've seen have been real. So it's about some of those earlier points raised. It's about some of the social problems associated with housing can't be solved unless there's community, because with community comes dialogue, and with dialogue comes actions and results. And that's not necessarily something from the federal government. That's just been my own experience.
Excellent. Well, that's the end of the questions. Any of the panelists want to do a last, just a quick comment at the end? You don't have to, but if you want to, go ahead.
I'm just going to say, I'll start off, Brad. I like I said in the beginning, I think I learned a lot more than I offered to this discussion, and it's so important having an understanding as a federal representative about what's going on the ground, especially in another province and community. I take to heart the comments made about wraparound services, about it's more than just bricks and mortars, and where the federal government can play a role. And I even see here the last comment, it says, how can large-scale appropriate low-income social housing and nonprofit housing be developed quicker? That's the question I'm tasked with every day, and I believe the government can do it quicker, and that CMHC, which administers many of these funds, have heard loud and clear from stakeholders across Canada that if the federal government is going to play a role, that they need to do a better job with what they purport to do. And that starts with making improvements to the co-investment fund to make sure that money's getting out the door faster. And secondly, with other programs like the Rapid Housing Initiative, that it's more equitable and serves all communities and is accessible to all communities across Canada. But to all the other panelists and the people on the call today, this was a really, really useful hour, and I'm very thankful to have to learn from you tonight.
Thanks. Anyone else?
I'll just say, in response to that last question, it's not how can we do it quicker, but how do we do it better? And I think better means more consultation with communities on what the needs are, and not top-down approaches from governments, but working with communities, because those are the sustainable solutions. And I think a lot of the housing has to be community-based and community-delivered housing. So I'll leave it there, and thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Ian?
I think I just want to leave, especially the community members from Saskatoon's West End that have attended, thank you for attending, and, take the time, if you do have a CRESS or a Camponi unit within your neighborhood, take the time to get to know them. You'll find that they have really unique stories. It could be a single mother, first-time college graduate that are working through university. They're really unique stories, really unique perspectives, and I'm always very proud of our tenants, and I think it's we're just trying to get everybody to a point that they need to get to by housing, and we're going to continue to do so in Saskatoon. So thank you.
Lynn?
Yeah, I'd like to reiterate what both Lynn and Ian have said so far. But the one piece I'd like to add is to thank you for having us on this panel today, and to please continue the consultation with the grassroots organizations.
I appreciate that, Lynn. And like Brad Viss said, I learned a lot here. We took a lot of notes. There's just so much to unpack in this area. And so I really do appreciate all of the comments from everybody tonight. It's been very, very helpful to me as I do my job representing this community in Ottawa. It's very, very helpful for me to have the best possible view that I can from the ground. And to everyone who took part and joined us in this call tonight, I'm sorry we didn't answer all the questions, but hopefully you got a pretty good sense of the situation here and appreciated the comments. I know I sure did. So to all the panelists, I thank you so much for coming. It was very, very helpful, and I really do appreciate it. And I would like to do this again. So Lynn, we'll work on that and keep the conversations going. So thanks everybody. We're going to shut her down there, and just appreciate that. And of course, our office is always open for anybody that has issues with the federal government. We can do our best to help you out. So thanks everybody for joining, and we'll see you at the next one. Thanks.